Hello, this is Coach Wilson, and this is Unit 4, Day 2. Today I'd like for you to talk about a hero. Explain a day from beginning to end, a day in the life of a hero. Real, fictional, alive, or dead. You may choose someone who's a family member that you consider a hero. It may be a fictional or made-up hero, or it may be a historical figure or a president. I would like for you to write 5 to 6 sentences and tell me what it would be like to be them for a day. Now, today we're going to continue our unit on growth and disunion in the United States. We've been talking about sectional differences, and we're going to continue doing that today. Now, the first issue that we're going to speak about is slavery. And there was this big argument over whether there would be slavery in the newly acquired Louisiana Territory, all of that land that Thomas Jefferson had purchased in 1804. Now, in 1819, Missouri applies for statehood. And one of the issues here is that they wanted to be a slave state. They wanted to have slavery in their state. And at the time, there was a balance of 11 free states and 11 slave states. And that's important because in Congress, that meant in the Senate, there was an even balance of states that agreed with slavery and states that were against slavery. That way, one group wasn't overpowering the other. Now, one of the arguments to try to bring in Missouri as a state was to give them gradual emancipation. And that was brought up by James Talmadge, a New York congressman who proposed inside of Missouri's statehood bill this idea that over time they would gradually get rid of slavery. The problem is that this doesn't work so well with Southerners who see this as a way for the North to begin eradicating slavery, which they see as vital to their economy. That's why it passed in the House, where we have a lot different representation, and there's not equal representation for every state like there is in the Senate. Now, the Missouri Compromise is brought on in 1820, and it was brought on as a reason because you had two states, or two sides that are arguing over the North wants to end slavery, and the South, they feel like they need it for their economy. And step in Henry Clay, our great compromiser. And what he comes up with is that in the Louisiana Territory, all states above the 3630 line will be free, except for Missouri. Below that line will be slave territories. All right, so any future states that form, they will be slave states. Anyone above that line will be free states. And lastly, Maine, which for the longest period of time was a territory controlled by Massachusetts, will now become its own state, and it will be a free state. Now, if you want to know where the 3630 line is, if you look there above the Arkansas Territory, you'll see a red line. And it kind of goes across Tennessee and North Carolina. You could almost draw a straight line there. That is the Missouri Compromise line. Now, obviously Virginia, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri are all above that line. They're still going to remain as slave states. But for any future state that is above that line, they will be considered a free state if they apply for statehood and it's approved. Now, here's a look at the map. You can see the Adams-Onis Treaty line, which we talked about in 1819, and then you can see the Missouri Compromise line. So now we have all of this territory that's unorganized that eventually it, along with the Michigan Territory, are going to become states. And so the South, even though it has agreed to this deal, realizes that there's going to be issues later on. Now, the U.S. economy is pretty divided. You have the North who is focused on industry and the South who is focused primarily on agriculture. And Samuel Slater is one of the big reasons the North has gotten big into industry. He had been able to smuggle plans in the United States and began building factories with textile mills. Okay? And Northern farmers who had forever been stuck in the fields are now going to be pushed to move towards industry, where they don't have to subsistence farm anymore, where they're providing everything for themselves. Now they can go and become an industrialist, and they're given a paycheck, and then they go buy the goods that they need. During this time, the South has also began trading with Britain due to the large amount of people who are going to the factories in the North. And when we start talking about tariffs, and we talked about the protective tariff in the American system, when we start talking about tariffs, that's one of the reasons that Southerners were very upset with the North, is that these tariffs hurt their trade with Britain because Britain was making less money because they couldn't sell anything here. They were getting taxed. Now, just to kind of go through some of those differences, in the economy, the North is industrialized, the South is agricultural and dependent on slavery. And most Southerners felt that if they lost slaves, they could not run their plantations or their farms or survive. In the North, the population is growing much, much more rapidly than it is in the South. You have a middle class starting to form because of all of the development of industry. You also have this working class that is developing along with immigrants, who are coming in and getting involved in the workforce. But because of these immigrants coming in, you're also going to see immigrants facing a lot of prejudice. Germans and Irish are going to face a lot of prejudice during the 1820s and 30s. And many of these groups are being they're being treated poorly because they're taking jobs from those Americans who are already working in those areas. So it's more of just an issue of job availability rather than actually being upset that they're immigrating into the country. In the South, there's a much lower population, very much slower growth in regards to people coming in. There's not a lot of immigration, and there's a lot lower education requirements in the South because many of these people are growing up on farms and they're getting more of what we would call a working education rather than a formal school education, what we would consider a school education with reading and math and things of that nature. Now, because of industrialization, the North begins to grow quite rapidly and develop cities. These cities grow exponentially because you have more of these farmers who are out in rural areas coming out of the city, and they're going to put down roots for a lot of reasons, but one of the main ones being that you don't have the same travel ability that you will later on in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, the ability to get around by train, eventually obviously the car in the early 1900s. Those things don't exist, so when they go to the city to work, they're going to try to find a way to live there. Industrialization is spreading quickly all over the North, and it is a stark difference to that of the South that has very few large cities, very limited development regionally. It's very much rural areas, small towns, and slavery is continuing to spread across the South. Right? Plantations are getting much more powerful, and a lot of the wealth that is in the South is concentrated on these plantations, despite the fact that there are a lot of people living who either don't own a slave or don't have any wealth really to speak of, minus just being able to survive on what is probably their little home-owned farm. Now, there are some common interests between these two regions, and the biggest one is cotton. Both relied on the cotton crop to function. Cotton was traded with Europe from the South. It was traded with the North for the textile mills. Both are relying on this new technology that develops in the cotton gin, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in day 3. But when Eli Whitney develops the cotton gin, cotton becomes much more profitable, and it's going to increase this need for slavery, which is interesting because the North wants to end slavery, but it's not hesitant to take all of the cotton that the South will sell them during this time. Now, here are your 3 questions for the day. Please make sure you're answering these at the end of each day of notes. And here are your 4 vocabulary words. If you have any problems, please let me know. If not, I'll talk to you soon.